Last week we talked about Paul coming from Athens, going to Corinth, and it's a crazy environment. And then we see that he's terrified of their culture. It's a crazy place that's totally foreign to him and his background. And in multiple places we see that Paul said that he went with fear and trembling. But that presented this awesome opportunity for the gospel to come in and for it to shine brightly in the midst of a dark place. And so Paul starts a vibrant church, 3, 4, 5 home churches of 15 people. And then he goes on, he moves on, and he's like, you guys are going to have to continue, keep doing what you're doing, grow the church, but I'm going to go to a new city, and I'm going to preach the gospel to them. Well, while he's in Ephesus, a short journey away on a ship, he gets word that, they're in a hot mess. Crazy things are happening, right? There's more immorality, fighting. They're taking each other to court. They're getting drunk on the communion wine. And what does Paul have to say? Well, last week we saw that Paul said, God is faithful who called you into fellowship with his Son, Jesus Christ. So last week we saw Paul is just calling them back to, here are the teachings of Jesus. This is what God calls for, but he's really affirming them. He doesn't come, insulting them, but at the same time, he wants to address what's going on. And so today, we'll see how Paul begins to address the numerous issues that exist in this church. Paul begins, or continues, I should say, by saying, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another, that in what you say that there is no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. And so what we see first is that Paul says, I appeal to you. In some of your translations, it may say exhort. This word really means to correct. He's like, I've heard about an issue, and I've got something to say about it. You guys need to change. But I think what's striking is what it is that Paul starts with. Paul says that all of you need to agree with one another, that there's no divisions, that you're perfectly united in mind and thought. Now, Paul isn't saying that a church should just be cookie-cutter people, just cutouts and a weird sort of, unanimity where everyone is the exact same. That's not what Paul is advocating for. But you think about it, out of all the sins that Paul could start to address, someone sleeping with his father's wife, them worshiping idols, the false teaching, getting drunk on the communion wine. There are so many issues which you would, maybe as a natural human being want to go and just address first. But what he does is he addresses the issue of unity first, and he hits it really hard. And Paul's going to get to all the rest. But what Paul is saying here is that unless we are united, none of this other stuff matters. And so what we see by Paul placing this first is that unity in Christianity is of the highest importance. Right? It seems like a strange choice. Many of us would be like, okay, what about the way that you use your language? Or what about, not getting drunk? Maybe, Brian, you're pushing your own agenda a little bit here. You're taking the issue a little bit too far. Perhaps, because Paul, placed this first, that's not really the order of importance. But I would argue that we should look to the rest of the Bible, and especially the New Testament, to see how important unity actually is. What we find is that disunity is death to the Christian community. This is what Jesus says. If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided, that house cannot stand. So, cleaning up your act, changing your behaviors, keeping your zipper up, all of those things are secondary to unity. The focal point of the church is being united. And without it, it all falls apart. I was, given this reference by a real history buff. He was a college seminary student, and he was studying for his master's thesis. He was studying how it was that a country like Germany, who gave us someone like Martin Luther, the great reformer, the country that modernized, that really gave us the great grace awakening that many of us today benefit from. How did that country go from one that was at the forefront of grace to allowing Nazis to steamroll their message of hate? And he's like, I was reading this great book called The Nazi Persecution of the Churches, and in it, he found this amazing quote. Hitler himself said this. He said, "Later that I realized one cannot break the church over one's knee. It has to be left to rot like a gangrenous limb." Now, obviously, this is a bit of a paraphrase, but what Hitler is saying in this moment is he's saying, when I went against the church, when I was trying to fight against them, in a unified way, they would fight back against me. And so what Hitler's strategy was to leave the church to infighting. Allow them to debate the politics, allow them to debate all of the issues, distract them away from the unity that they have in Christ. And what happens? The whole thing falls apart. What we also see in the New Testament is that God achieved our unity through Christ. In 1 Peter chapter 3, it says, "For Christ died for our sins once and for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit." Paul was alluding to this in the first 10 verses. He's reminding them of the fact that before they knew Christ, they were disunified. They were found against God. But what did Christ do as this unifying point? All of them, everyone in this Corinthian church was able to come before God and say, I need the forgiveness given through Christ's death. And as a result, they had this unifying, this centralized point in which they all shared in common. And so Christ went out and fought for that on all of humanity's behalf. Paul continues this in Romans chapter 6. He says, we have been united with him, Christ, in death. We will certainly also be united with him. And so Christ afforded this opportunity not only to be united with him, but also to be united with each other. And this is something that the Bible, over and over again, says that we need to preserve, that we need to keep, that we need to remain established. Another point that we find in the New Testament is that without unity, the world has no basis to believe in Christ. Unity is of such importance that if we do not have it, it gives people reason not to believe in Jesus. The outside world is not supposed to look at the church and say, well, gee, look at the people in the church. Look how clean they are. Look how moral they are. I want to be just like them. Look how well put together they are. They don't drink. They don't cuss. There are plenty of other places with people who are far more moral than us. Let's be honest. With ourselves, I first and foremost know that there are people in other religions who practice so much more fervently than I do. But according to Jesus, having your life put together is not what people are supposed to see. Jesus says this, a new commandment that I give to you, that you love one another even as I have loved you. That you would love one another, and by this all men will know that you are my disciples. The number one thing is that you guys are to be united in love. And the proof that they will know who Jesus is, who he is, he continues in John 17. He says, my prayer is not for them alone, I pray also for those who will believe through their message, that all of them may be one, right? That all of them may be united, just like, Father, you and I are united. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you sent me. So when Paul addresses this concept first, in this crazy church with so many problems, what he's saying is that unity comes first. When you get a group of people together, it gets messy quickly. But before anything else, Paul and God says we need to address unity. If we aren't unified, we are like a ship in the water without a sail. There's no power. There's nothing of convincing effort. So let's see how Paul begins to address this issue of unity in the Corinthian church. He says, "My dear brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's house," this must have been one of Paul's compatriots, one of his companions, maybe a tattletale, we don't know. "Some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is that one of you says, 'I follow Paul.' Another of you says, 'I follow Apollos.' Another one says, 'I follow Cephas,' or Peter. Another one still says, 'Well, I follow Christ.'" That's probably the smart aleck one. You know, they're like, "Oh, yeah, I got the right answer. I follow Jesus." Yes, of course you do, but you're still not unified. So what's going on in this church? Well, one of the things that's happening that Paul is addressing here is they seem to be putting their leaders on pedestals. They are raising the people that they are following to a stature, to a place that they shouldn't. Surprise, we still do this today, right? We do this with our political leaders. We do this with our church leaders. Look at one scandal after the next, after the next, after the next. It's because we place them on pedestals. We say how these people are so amazing and how they're so important, right? I'm not amazing. I'm not important. I should be pushing you towards Christ. That's my job. And if we start to elevate people beyond that, we begin to have a problem. And that's what they were doing. Paul, he says, I came and I came scared and terrified. My words, they were trembling. He didn't really speak Greek very well. And so a lot of people were looking to him. They're like, "Oh, but he's planting all these other churches, and so he's my ambassador." And then other people were just like, I follow Apollos. This guy was very articulate, spoke Greek extremely well, very well versed in what it meant to argue and be involved in the philosophies of the day. Peter, well, that makes a lot of sense. Peter had a great influence for the church. Maybe the Jewish Christians were sitting around, "Well, I want to be like Peter. He seems to be preaching to all of his fellow Jews. I'll follow Christ." Like we said, this is probably the smart aleck in the group. Like, of course you do. Like, whatever. But the point is that they are creating these weird cliques and factions depending on who it is that they follow. And I think this is just one form of disunity. We will see plenty more in this book. I think basically on the disunity spectrum, you have like on one side where people are being actively disunified. They are actively doing things which bring about hurting, harming, or interfering with God's unity. On the opposite side, there's passive disunity. This is sins of omission. This means not loving someone. You can sit around and have a pretty moral life, and people can look at you and say, "Oh, maybe they're reading their Bible. They're probably pretty cool." But if they're not moving towards God, and if they're not moving towards others, then they're not really living out the unity that God is asking. So on the active side, we have things like quarrels, like Paul is addressing here. Later on, we will see that there are lawsuits. These guys are taking each other to court, trying to sue each other, get money from one another. And Paul is going to just rip them a new one. He's going to say, you guys should be able to, with the unity of Christ, be able to solve this situation. Don't you have people who are smart enough and who are empowered with the Spirit to help you walk through this and figure it out? They're verbally attacking one another, undermining each other, constantly talking about how my gift is better than your gift, trying to create for themselves a name or an image and putting other people down. Some of them are seeking revenge. We do this too. Someone said something to me and it hurt me. And that may be a totally legitimate thing. But rather than seeking resolution, rather than moving towards the person, rather than seeing how Christ views this person, we say to ourselves, I want my pound of flesh. I want to see them punished. I want their name dragged through the mud. And in our culture, it's become, I want them canceled. I want their life to become so dissatisfying, and I'm going to revel in it. But if we want someone to suffer, we're not moving in the direction that Christ asks. A pound of flesh never heals a wound. Forgiveness is what the Bible says will actually heal our wounds over time. What about this? Being passive or passive-aggressive. Right? We put on a good face. We pretend that everything's fine. Maybe we do the good Christian service of being kind to their face. But in the background, in our hearts, we're really frustrated at them. We fail to bring up the issue. We fail to correct the wrong that we see in their lives. This is going on in the Corinthian church as well. How about this? Being passive-aggressive and giving people the cold shoulder. Right? Sending out cold vibes, as one might say nowadays. You go out of your way to avoid this person. Right? They said something a long time ago that hurt you. And then now, what you do is you just avoid them. You get in the same room as them, and you find yourself on the other side. Maybe it's this person has a personality that just rubs or butts heads with yours. But again, this is refusing to resolve or to confront issues with people. What about gossip? Taking other people's private information and using it for our own entertainment. Can you believe what this person said? Isn't this funny? How this other person was, caught in this situation. Or what we're trying to do is bring them down. We're trying to make ourselves look better by really rubbing their face in the dirt. Can you believe this person did this? But I would never do that. And it's just an effort to make ourselves look better. Or we involve ourselves in cliques. Again, happening in the Corinthian church. We've all got our own little special group of people. And if someone approaches us, maybe we're sitting in a meeting, maybe it's like we're hanging out with friends, maybe we're sitting at the lunch table. Someone approaches us, sure, we'll engage them, we'll interact with them. But otherwise, when someone new shows up, they often feel uninvited. And I think this just happens almost every week in all of our meetings. We're not thinking about how we involve. We're not thinking how to connect. We're not thinking about creating a welcoming environment. And so here is this passive form of sowing disunity. And you may be thinking to yourself, every community that I've ever been a part of has these things. And you know what? You're exactly right. The world is doing this. Our church is doing this. Every community group that you've ever been a part of is doing this. Every workplace is doing this. Our world is becoming more polarized, more politicized, more tribalized, more radicalized than ever. But what is Jesus saying? We, as a church, cannot afford to do this. Our unity is directly connected to God's goodness and his message of forgiveness. And so if we choose to go in this direction, it means that people have an incredibly harder time, if not maybe impossible time, of coming to understand that message. So Paul is addressing their disunity. He's actually speaking up, saying something, making sure that something changes. But how does he specifically fix the situation? Well, Paul tells them, is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God I did not baptize any of you except for Crispus and Gaius, so that no one can say that you were baptized in my name. Yes, also I baptized the house of Stephanas, and beyond that I don't know. But if I don't remember if I baptized anyone else. I really love this little section. It's pretty awesome. Paul starts off and he gets real sarcastic. Right? Is Christ divided? Absolutely not. I've been preaching about the unity that Christ brings for the past 10 verses. That's what Paul's saying. You guys, the reason I'm able to move towards you in love, the reason I'm not picking you apart, the reason that I'm not destroying you as a community is because God is asking me to love you. God is asking me to demonstrate that unity with you. And so I come with, a big stick, but I'm walking gently. We're going to make sure that you understand this, but at the same time, I want you to understand that you're loved. Christ is the entire basis for that unity and love. Paul wasn't crucified. Peter wasn't crucified. Apollos wasn't crucified. No, you all have that unity, not because of the leaders who brought you the message, but for the man who that message represents, Jesus. And then this part's, I think, hilarious. I think what this section here shows is that, first of all, the eraser had not been invented yet. Paul sitting down with, a piece of not papyrus, but, paper, which was very expensive that time, ink, which was very expensive that time, and he's writing this letter out. And so as he's writing this letter out, he's like, oh, shoot, I'm already like 10 verses in, and I just messed up. Crap. But what it shows is that Paul's not perfect. Right? It's the exact thing that Paul is actually trying to show. You guys shouldn't be putting your leaders on pedestals. Why? Because they're not perfect. And look, this right here shows exactly that. I messed up. I think what this also shows is a great deal of authenticity. Paul's like, okay, I can't go back now. I baptized these guys, and then I think I baptized these guys. I didn't baptize. Okay, I baptized a couple more. Yeah, sure, that's right. But really what he's showing is like, I care about you guys. Yes, I baptized some of you, but that who I am and what I did is not the point. So as we see Paul addressing this, bringing it up, I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what do we do? I want to take a while just to walk through this, because I think this is really important as a church. I think this is really important in the New Testament. And I think it's important to get practical on issues that are important. I think the first thing that we need to do is realize that there is a great opportunity set out before us. And when I say there's a great opportunity set out before us, I mean literally us here, right now, all of us in this room. There is a great opportunity for us to take God's message forward. The Pew Research Center. I was reading an article from them recently, and it was about how, as you can see here, Americans see stronger societal conflicts than people in other countries. This comes from actually a larger study where they were interviewing and asking questions about conflict and societal conflict. And in this, there are a number of questions. I'm only going to highlight a couple of them. But I think this will go to show the environment in which we find ourselves in. They asked this question: is there strong or very strong conflict between people who hold different political ideas or are a part of different political parties? So this isn't just like weak conflict. This is the strongest kind of conflict. So in the world, people said, yes, people of different political parties, they are in strong conflict. That was 50% of the world. That makes sense. most times, 50% of us are on one side, 50% of us on the other side. There's some sort of conflict in between. In the United States, 90%. 90% of the people interviewed said that people of various political parties are in strong or very strong opposition or conflict with one another. Way more divided right here at home. Racial identity, from people from different backgrounds, how much in conflict are they? The world, 48%. The United States, 71%. Way more conflict at home. Strong conflict on societal facts. Okay, this one requires a little bit of explanation. So the way that they phrased this question was that when it comes to important issues facing society, this may be like inequality, poverty, discrimination, they said, people may disagree over politics or policies on those issues, but do people strongly oppose each other even on the basic facts? Like, do they agree about what poverty even is? Do they agree about what indiscrimination is? Do they agree that inequality exists? The world, 40%. United States, 59%. Now, this is not some sort of geopolitical trying to degrade America moment. That's not what I'm trying to do here. What I'm trying to do is shape our perspective. I want you to understand the culture in which you live. We have an opportunity. Right now, America seems to be more divided than ever. People are more hostile, more bitter, more frustrated with the person next door than they've ever been. More so than most of the places in the entire world. So what does that mean for us? This means, and this is important, this means that God's message of unity should stand out even brighter in the context we're in. This is not some sort of opportunity, again, to mourn, to be frustrated, to fight, to try to fight back, to take something back. No, we have this incredible opportunity in our midst to shine brightly as an example of what it means to be unified. But what will it mean for you and I? Well, like we were talking about last week, it means that it will cost us more. Because the people around you will tell you, you should be bitter, you should be outraged, you should subtweet, you should feel, you should get that pound of flesh. And it's going to be even harder to not do the things that the people around you are doing. It's going to be even harder not to complain and be frustrated and constantly berate the political leaders, the religious leaders, the people around you, just for the sake of doing it, because that's what others are doing. And so God is saying that if in the midst of this you can be united as if I'm asking, that means the gospel should be even more powerful. And this is exactly what we've been looking at this morning. God is asking us to demonstrate the gospel in our unity with one another. More specifically, as I'm thinking about our church, we're not the kind of people who are constantly, beating each other up, insulting one another. That's not who we are, right? This is a moment just me and you guys. That's not who we are. That's not our style. You know what our style is? Not doing something. That's us. Now, I'm sure there are a couple of us who our style is fighting. We'll talk about that in a minute, but the vast majority of us, if we were picking a side, it's the side where we're not investing. We're not bringing the conflict up. We're not addressing the issue that we see in someone's life. Just the other day, I was talking to a couple of co-leaders of mine, and we noticed that all of us had the same opinion about another individual. And you know what we began to realize? is that even though we had been talking about it, none of us had brought the issue up with the other person. Right? We all had the same issue. It seemed like God was saying, the Bible was saying that this person needs to be corrected in this direction. And guess what? We didn't do it. That's disrupting the unity. Right? We look to these one another passages. John 13, John 17, it says that we should love one another. And this is found in 1 John, in Hebrews, and Peter. There's this central message. This is what unity looks like, to love one another as God loved Christ, Christ loved God. That's what we do. But then under that subheading, there are over 40 verses in the New Testament which go on to describe what that loving one another looks like. Encouraging, getting together, devoted to one another, honoring one another, serving one another, accepting one another, humility, right? And on and on and on and on and on. You want to know what unity looks like? It means doing all of these things. It's not getting drunk. God is saying if you want to prioritize something in your Christian life, pick one of those. Find the one on that list that you're bad at. Find the one on that list that you don't know how to do. Find the one on that list that maybe you're good at. But do it. Move towards people. This means time, effort, energy, investing in people, loving people, coming prepared to meetings, getting involved in people's lives. This is not something you can do just showing up. In fact, one of these is actually coming to a meeting prepared with things that God has been telling you. And so God is saying, we do not measure our Christianity by the words we use. We do not measure our Christianity by the songs that we sing. We do not measure our Christianity by how much we know the Bible. The thing that we measure our Christianity by, the thing that we measure our church by, is this: unity. What is this going to mean? Well, if we're looking at that list, one of the many things, a couple of the many things in there means engaging in righteous conflict. Again, most of us are a little more on the passive side. So that means that we need to speak up. Right? Paul puts it this way. He says, instead, speak the truth in love. Then we will grow in every respect to become the mature body of Him who is the head, Christ. So there's one half which is speaking the truth. People who are aggressive, they are able to speak the truth. But it's also, do you do it lovingly? Do you address them in the way that the Bible is asking you to address them? Now, the moral of the story, right? I don't want you guys to get the impression that in all of this that we're not supposed to do anything, to not bring stuff up, to push it down, to forgive everything, to never hold others accountable. But on the flip side, we're also not flying off on every emotional bent that we feel like we have just to feel justified. The Bible tells us that we do need to speak the truth in love. I think an incredible book that is really helpful in how to navigate conflict, if you've never read it, I think it's got to be in my Christian top 10. It's Ken Sande's The Peacemaker. This book is phenomenal when it comes to thinking through conflict and how to do it in a unifying way. Let me just give you a couple of examples. He gives us a great framework for looking at what conflict should even be like. He says that there are many conflicts that can be properly resolved only through confrontation, right? There's some things you have to confront. Some through confession, some through forgiveness, and some through cooperative negotiation. Yeah, there are things that we have to say to people in a Christian church. But there are hundreds more that can be properly resolved simply by overlooking minor offenses or relinquishing our rights for the sake of God's kingdom. So he's not advocating that we cover things up. Right? That's not the standard. But what he's saying is what is good for God should also be good for you as the individual. What is good for you as the individual should also be good for God. He continues. He says, therefore, before focusing on your rights, take a careful look at your responsibilities, and before you go to remove the speck from your brother's eye, ask yourself, is this really worth fighting over? Love how Psalm 73 says this. He says, when my heart was grieved and my spirit embittered, I was senseless, I was ignorant, I was a brute beast before you. How many of you have ever felt bitter towards someone and felt this way? It just becomes all-consuming. You're watching all the things that they do, all the actions that they take, filtering it through the worst lens. Oh, I can't believe this person said this thing to me, and then I can't believe what they're spending their money on, and I can't believe how they affect other people, and I can't believe that God would grant them or bless them in this sort of way. I can't believe that they're so entitled, right? Everything they do begins to just constantly be filtered through that. We become more outraged. We become more bittered. And so being a complainer, being a conflict embedder, is not what God is asking us to do. But he's also not asking us to sit by either. Right? Sometimes there's this righteous thing that God is asking us to confront. And if we sit on it, bitterness can build as well. Sandy, again, in The Peacemaker, gives us two options. He says, on the one hand, we need to understand what overlooking the offense is, but on the other, we need to confront the offender. When we're talking about overlooking, he says, first, the offense should not have created a wall between you and the other person, or caused you to feel differently towards him or her for more than a short period of time. So what he's saying is when you get in a conflict, maybe take a moment. Think about it. Don't just react right there in the moment, but is this thing something that's actually causing you grief or frustration for more than a couple of days? Second, the offense should not be doing serious harm to God's reputation or to others or to the offender. So if something's small, if it's not serious, what do? You let it go. Again, this is what the Proverbs say. Sensible people control their temper. They earn respect by overlooking wrongs. Yes, there is something that God loves and appreciates when we just overlook the small stuff. When confronting people, right? On the other hand, the Bible teaches that it is sometimes appropriate to exercise our rights to confront others, to hold them fully accountable for their responsibilities and all of their wrongs. Here again, the concept of stewardship serves as a guiding principle. I love what he's doing here. He's talking about conflict in the sense of stewardship. Conflict is an opportunity, as he'll say later on, to show either how big of a God you have or how small of a God you have. Conflict is not something to be avoided. Conflict is not something that's wrong or evil. What he is saying is that conflict, like we were saying before, brings out the opportunity to have God be glorified. And so, is this thing going to be helpful? Is this thing going to be good? Would God approve of this? Should be the rubric, should be the way that we judge going about the conflict. Again, he has a whole checklist. This is just two of many questions. He says, will exercising my rights please and honor God? Will exercising my rights advance God's kingdom, or will it advance only my own interest at the expense of the kingdom? Is this about me? Is this about my feelings, my comfort? Or is this about God being glorified? Some of us will need to learn to let the offense go. That's some of us. I think for the majority of us, it means that we need to stop being pushovers. When we see something going on in someone's life that is discrediting who God is, we have a responsibility to say something. Two more, and I think these are real quick. Preach the gospel in words. Paul's solution in the midst of this, their conflict, is what he tells them. He says that Christ did not send me to baptize. I wasn't sent to be put up on a pedestal. I wasn't here to make you become a part of my clique. My job was just to preach the gospel. I didn't do this with wisdom. I didn't do it with eloquence. I did it with Simple words so that the cross, or the power of the cross would not be emptied. Paul's going to say this many times as we go throughout the book. And I think the message we need to take home is that preaching the gospel together, and again, this is for us, right here, right now. Preaching the gospel together, finding people, engaging with them, giving them the gospel, helping each other to give the gospel to the people that we are interacting with, is one of the best ways to exercise this unity. Of course it is. If the way that we are unified is the fact that we have been brought together through Christ, then what better way is there to experience that and to express that than to give that to other people? Finally, if you're here this morning and you don't know God, you don't have a relationship through Christ, I would ask that you observe us. We're not perfect. We definitely mess up. We have a lot of flaws. But God says that you should be able to investigate, that you should be able to see our lives and see something unique and different. And if that's the case, I don't think that's the sole reason or the only reason, but I think that that's good cause, like Jesus says, to investigate further the things that God has to say. And I would encourage you to do that.